My parents left me alone in the ICU to celebrate my brother's birthday. I always thought I was just a burden until the police arrived and revealed I was a child kidnapped 30 years ago. Then, a billionaire walked in and fell to his knees before me. Can you imagine hitting rock bottom, lying in a hospital bed, arm shattered, and the only people you thought would help just hang up on you? What if that brutal rejection was actually the first crack in a lie so massive, it had consumed your entire life for 30 years? My final shift that day ended with the horrifying screech of steel and a searing pain ripping through my arm. When I finally came to, I was in a cold, white hospital room, one side of my body wrapped tightly in bandages. Trembling, I picked up my phone. There was only one number I could think to call: my parents. The only people I still believed could help me. They answered, stayed silent for a few agonizing seconds, then my mother's voice, as sharp and cold as a blade, cut through the line: "We can't do anything for you." And then she hung up. Just like that. I remember thinking, this is just them being them. Just the usual coldness from a family that, deep down, I always suspected had never truly loved me. But I was so wrong. So unbelievably, gut-wrenchingly wrong. That was just the beginning of a nightmare I couldn't have possibly imagined. That was until two strangers appeared in my hospital room, holding a thick stack of documents and a DNA test result. They said something to me that day, something I can still hear echoing in my ears, because that was the precise moment I realized that for over 30 years, I had been living a life that was never, ever mine. Hello. My name is Wyatt Dempsey. Or at least, that's what I thought it was. I'm not the kind of person who likes talking about himself, but if you're still listening, I guess I have to try. 2 years of my life, the last 2 years, have taught me that sometimes the worst things happen not to destroy you, but to force you to face the truth, no matter how painful it is. I don't know where this story will take you, but for me, it all began on a cold, rainy afternoon in the suburbs of Rockford, Illinois, where everything I thought I knew about my life shattered in a single, brutal moment. I lived in a small, rented apartment in South Rockford, you know the kind of place? Faded red brick buildings, pothole-riddled streets. My apartment was nothing special: a tiny living room, a greasy kitchen corner, and a single bed pushed against a window overlooking the highway. Every morning, I was up at 5 a.m., pulling on my navy blue work coveralls, strapping on a hard hat, and driving my beat-up old truck to Rockford Metal Works. My job was operating the steel press, inspecting components, keeping everything running smoothly. I didn't complain. I never made trouble. And I always stayed late. My coworkers, they called me Quiet Wyatt because I rarely spoke unless I absolutely had to. For me, work was a way to keep my mind busy, to keep from thinking about other things. Like family. Or, what passed for family. My monthly paycheck was just enough to cover rent, gas, and a few small necessities. The rest? I sent it straight to my parents in Beloit, Wisconsin, a small town about an hour's drive from Rockford. My father, Carl Dempsey, was 63, a retired industrial supervisor. He lived in a tidy 2-story house with a white picket fence and a neatly trimmed lawn. He was a rigid, cold man. His favorite saying, one he'd hammered into my head since I was a kid, was, "A man has to pull himself up. Don't expect help from anyone." And maybe because of those words, I learned not to beg, not to ask for anything. But sometimes, I wondered if he ever saw me as a son, or just a debt to be paid off. My mother, Lorraine Dempsey, was 59. She ran a small home goods store in downtown Beloit. The neighbors adored her, always praising her as this kind, capable woman with a bright smile. But to me, she was an unsolvable puzzle. Whenever I visited, she'd ask a few polite questions, but her eyes always made me feel like I owed her something. Like my very existence was a burden she had to bear. I didn't blame her, not really. I just tried to do better, hoping that one day she'd look at me without that immense weight in her gaze. And then there was Cole, my younger brother, 3 years my junior. Cole was the kind of person you couldn't ignore. Tall, talkative, always laughing, and spending money like it was water. He never held a job for more than 3 months, but somehow, my parents absolutely doted on him. Whatever Cole wanted, he got. A new car? Dad would sign the check. A gambling debt? Mom would quietly pay it off. Meanwhile, I was still driving the same rickety truck from high school, and every penny I earned went toward keeping my own life from falling apart. The Dempsey family was a strange picture, you know? One where nothing ever felt fair. I remember family dinners around the wooden table in the dining room. Cole would ramble on about some half-baked business idea, and my parents would just nod and praise him like he'd invented the wheel. Me? I could talk about working overtime for a month straight to fix some critical machine at the factory, and my father would give a half-hearted nod while my mother glanced at me with a look that said, "What's that supposed to prove?" I learned to stay quiet, swallowing the words I wanted to say, hoping the meal would end quickly so I could retreat to my room. I'm not one to complain, but that favoritism? It cut into me like a small, dull knife, day after day. I used to think that if I just tried hard enough, worked harder, was more, something, they might see me differently. But the older I got, the more I realized that no matter what I did, I was just a faint shadow in their eyes. Cole was the light. I was merely there to fill the background. That afternoon, the rain was pouring. Drops pounded the factory's tin roof, creating a steady rhythm that somehow drowned out the noise of the machines. I was on my last shift, checking an old steel press that had been malfunctioning all week. My coworker, Jimmy, shouted over the din, "Wyatt, you done checking yet? Shift's almost over." I nodded, wiped the sweat from my forehead, and leaned down to inspect the machine's shaft. Something was off. The steel rod was jammed, causing the whole thing to shake abnormally. I reached in, trying to dislodge it, thinking it would only take a second. Then, everything happened too fast. A sharp crack rang out, like the world exploding. The machine suddenly roared back to life, that steel shaft spinning at a terrifying speed. I barely had time to scream before it felt like my right arm was being devoured. The pain was so intense I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I collapsed onto the floor, blood gushing, pooling red on the cold concrete. My coworkers' shouts echoed somewhere in the distance, but everything faded as if I were sinking into a deep, nightmarish abyss. When I opened my eyes, blinding white light stung my vision. The sterile smell of antiseptic filled my nose, and the steady beep of a heart monitor sounded in my ears. I was in a hospital bed, my body heavy. My right arm numb and tightly wrapped in white bandages. A doctor stood beside me, his face serious, but his voice gentle. "You're awake, Wyatt. You had a serious accident. Your right arm is badly fractured, with nerve and muscle damage. Without surgery, soon, you could lose the ability to use it for a long, long time." I heard him, but it barely registered. My mind was stuck on one question: how much will this surgery cost? The doctor looked at me, hesitating, and didn't answer. He just said I should focus on resting and recovering. I nodded, forcing a weak smile. But inside, I felt my entire world crumbling. My right arm, wrapped in a cast, throbbed with pain, a constant reminder that every passing second brought me closer to the possibility of losing my ability to work. And working? That was the only thing keeping my life from slipping through my fingers. Lying there, the white fluorescent light from the ceiling stunned my eyes. I closed them, trying to push away the pain and the fear clawing at my chest. I didn't have good insurance. No savings. All I had was an old truck, a rundown rented apartment, and my parents. Carl and Lorraine Dempsey. They were my last flicker of hope. Despite years of feeling like an outsider in my own family, I still believed that in this moment, as I lay there with my arm nearly crushed, they wouldn't turn their backs on me. I took a deep breath and reached for the phone on the bedside table. Every movement made me grit my teeth in pain, but I ignored it. I dialed the number for the house in Beloit, listening to the slow, drawn-out rings, each one pulling me deeper into a bottomless pit. My mother answered. Her voice was soft, but so cold, like she was speaking to a bank clerk rather than her son. "Wyatt, what's wrong?" I tried to keep my voice steady, though my heart was pounding. "Mom, I had an accident at the factory. My arm, it's badly injured. The surgery costs a lot. I need help." I paused, waiting for a question. A word of comfort. Anything to show she cared. But there was only silence on the other end. Then my mother spoke, her voice flat. "I'll talk to your father. Wait for us to get back to you." And then she hung up. Without asking if I was in pain. If I was okay. I gripped the phone tightly, staring at the dark screen. "Get back to you." The words echoed in my mind, fragile as a promise I knew deep down would never be kept. But I waited. I told myself they'd call back soon. Maybe they were figuring out how to get the money, or driving here already. I pictured my mother walking into the hospital room, taking my hand. My father giving me a reassuring pat on the shoulder, saying everything would be all right. I clung to that image, even though deep inside I knew it was as distant as a dream I no longer had the faith to chase. Time dragged on. 1 hour. Then 2. The phone remained silent. I stared out the window where raindrops streaked down the glass, as blurry as my thoughts. The hospital room was cold, filled only with the steady beeping of the heart monitor and the faint shuffle of nurses' footsteps in the hallway. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw the steel press spinning wildly, heard the screech of metal, felt the pain tearing through my body. I'd jolt awake, gasping, sweat soaking my forehead, and then I'd look at the phone again, hoping the screen would light up with a call from Beloit. The next morning, still no word. I told myself they were probably busy. My father never liked being bothered, and my mother always had a million things to do at the store. But as the sun climbed higher, its harsh light streaming through the window, I couldn't lie to myself anymore. I dialed my father's number, my hand shaking so much I nearly dropped the phone. It rang 3 times before he picked up. "Wyatt?" His voice was gruff, carrying that familiar irritation I'd known since childhood. "What is it?" I repeated my story, trying to keep my voice from breaking. "Dad, I had an accident at the factory. My arm's badly hurt. I can't afford the hospital bills. I need you and Mom to help." I paused, waiting. But his response came faster than I expected, sharp and cold like a knife. "Don't bother us. We're too old to help." Then he hung up. Without explanation. Without hesitation. I stared at the phone in my hand, its black screen swallowing the last shred of hope I had. It felt like someone was squeezing my chest, making it impossible to breathe. I wanted to scream, to call back, to demand why. But I couldn't. I just sat there, silent, feeling like a part of me had died. That afternoon, I scrolled through my phone to pass the time, trying to distract myself from the pain gnawing at my mind. Then, I saw a post on social media from Cole, my younger brother. A photo of the whole family, gathered around a large birthday cake. Candles glowing. Bright smiles on my parents' faces, on Cole's face. His caption read, "Happy birthday, Dad. Family is everything." I stared at the photo. At each familiar face. Each joyful smile. And it felt like someone had stabbed me straight through the heart. They were celebrating, laughing, while I lay here alone with a crushed arm and a hospital bill looming over me like a mountain. I wasn't in that photo. I wasn't part of that joy. I had never truly been part of that family. I turned off the phone and tossed it to the foot of the bed. The pain in my arm was nothing compared to the loneliness swallowing me whole. I didn't cry. I didn't have the strength left to cry. I just sat there in the cold hospital room, listening to the rain falling outside the window. The steady patter of the rain seemed to tell the story of my life, a string of days spent trying, of hopes shattered, and of cold glances from the people I called family. I remember the days when I was young, maybe 5 or 6 years old. In the kitchen, Mom was cooking, the smell of mashed potatoes and stewed meat filling the room. I stood nearby, clutching the edge of the table, watching her with eager eyes, hoping for praise because I'd neatly set the dinner table. But she only glanced at me, a faint smile on her lips. "Wyatt, why are you so slow? You should have finished ages ago." Her voice was sweet, but her words were sharp, like a reminder that I was always falling short, that I never did enough. I lowered my head quietly, placing the plates on the table, feeling like I'd committed some great mistake, though I didn't understand why. Dad was different. He spoke little, but every word he uttered carried the weight of stone. He never talked to me, never asked what I liked, never shared stories about his days working in the industrial park. Instead, he gave orders. "Wyatt, clean the garage. Wyatt, fix the car. Wyatt, don't waste my time." I obeyed without question, because any delay would make his gaze freeze the entire room. Once, I spilled a glass of water during dinner. Just a glass of water. But Dad shot up, roaring as if I'd committed a terrible crime. "Foolish. Can't you do anything right?" He made me kneel in the cold garage for 3 hours, surrounded by old boxes and the sharp smell of motor oil. I knelt there, trembling, not daring to cry because I knew crying would only make him angrier. Meanwhile, Cole, my younger brother, seemed to live in a different world. When Cole messed up, everything was brushed off. He broke Mom's favorite vase, and she just laughed, ruffling his hair and saying, "It's okay, sweetheart. Just be careful next time." Cole lost his brand new bike, and Dad just shrugged, buying him another one the next week. Cole was the light in that house, while I was just a faint shadow, quietly doing everything to avoid being noticed, to avoid being blamed. My birthdays were the clearest proof of that difference. I remember my 8th birthday, when I eagerly awaited a gift. Anything. A toy car, a book, or even just a hug. But when I walked into the living room, Mom handed me an old, faded sweater that smelled of musty fabric. "It's Cole's, but he doesn't wear it anymore. Use it for now." I took the sweater, forcing a smile, but inside I felt hollow. No birthday cake, no candles, no words of celebration. Meanwhile, Cole's birthdays were always a grand event. The house sparkled with balloons. The table overflowed with sweets, and my parents beamed, taking pictures of him with expensive gifts. I stood in the corner of the room, pretending to be busy, but really just hiding the tears welling in my eyes. As I grew older, I tried to find ways to please my parents. I thought if I was good enough, obedient enough, hardworking enough, they'd see me differently. In high school, I wanted to join the football team. I dreamed of afternoons running on the field, hearing cheers, feeling like I belonged somewhere. But when I told Mom, she gave a faint laugh, her eyes cold. "Football? That's for kids from well-off families. Wyatt, you should get a job at the auto shop. Earn some money." I didn't argue, because I knew arguing was pointless. So, I spent my afternoons after school in the auto shop, hands stained with grease, while Cole was sent to college in the city, fully funded, with my parents boasting to relatives that he was the pride of the family. Every time I went home, I tried to do things to be noticed. I fixed the plumbing, mowed the lawn, repainted the fence, hoping just once to hear a thank you or see a nod of approval. But Dad stayed silent, and Mom glanced at me like my efforts were just obligations, not worthy of praise. I learned to endure, swallowing my disappointment, telling myself that if I tried long enough, one day, they'd see me. Truly see me as their son. The most painful memory that haunts me is the evening after my high school graduation. I stood on the porch, holding my diploma, filled with a mix of pride and hope. I'd worked hard, studied day and night to earn high grades, thinking this time my parents would look at me differently. But from inside the house, loud music blared. Cole was throwing a party with his friends, their laughter filling the air, lights from the living room spilling out into the yard. No one came out to see me. No one asked about my diploma. No one offered congratulations. I stood there under the dim streetlight, my shadow cast on the ground. The night air was cold, but not as cold as the loneliness crushing my heart. Now, lying in this hospital bed, those memories flooded back like a sentence passed long ago. I was never truly their son in their eyes. What I called family was just an empty shell, one I tried to fill with futile hopes. I closed my eyes, feeling tears spill down my cheeks. Not because of the pain in my arm, not because of the massive hospital bill. I cried for a truth I'd tried to avoid for 30 years, perhaps in all my life. I've never been truly loved. I opened my eyes and looked out the window. The rain still fell, steady, like a mournful song about my life. In this cold hospital room, I felt like a lost child, unsure of where I belonged. My parents abandoned me, not just today, but long ago, and I, despite trying my whole life, still hadn't found a place to call home. Several days had passed since my father hung up with his curt words, "Don't bother us." I no longer waited for a call. The phone lay silent at the foot of the bed, a lifeless object reminding me that the entire world seemed to have turned its back on me. My right arm, wrapped in a cast, still throbbed with pain, but I barely noticed. Physical pain couldn't compare to the emptiness gnawing at my heart. I lay there staring at the ceiling, trying not to think, but memories surged like relentless waves crashing against the shore. That morning, faint sunlight slipped through the window, casting a pale glow on the white-tiled floor of the hospital room. I heard the nurse's footsteps, the clinking of her tray as she changed my bandages. Each time she touched my arm, I gritted my teeth, but didn't cry out. I was used to enduring. She gave me a gentle smile, offering a few words of comfort, but I only nodded, not responding. I didn't want to talk. Didn't want anyone's pity. I just wanted to be alone to let the pain settle. Then the door swung open, startling me. Two men walked in, stern, composed, in a way that told me they weren't ordinary visitors. One was tall, with salt and pepper hair, dressed in a sharp gray suit. The other, younger, carried a thin stack of documents. They introduced themselves as agents from the FBI and the Rockford Police Department. My heart pounded, confusion swirling. I thought they might be here about the factory accident, perhaps a routine investigation into workplace safety. But their eyes, especially the older man's, carried something that unsettled me. "You're Wyatt Dempsey, correct?" the man with salt and pepper hair asked, his voice deep and clear. I nodded, trying to stay calm despite the storm brewing inside me. They asked me to confirm basic information: date of birth, place of birth, parents' names, social security number. I answered, my voice hoarse from days of little use. They took notes, nodded, but said nothing more. The air in the room grew heavy, as if something momentous was about to unfold. The younger man placed the stack of documents on the table, looked at me for a moment, then spoke with an oddly calm tone. "Mr. Wyatt, we're here to discuss an issue regarding your DNA records." I frowned, confused. DNA? I hadn't done anything wrong to warrant a DNA check. I wanted to ask, but my throat tightened. The older man continued. "When the hospital sent your blood sample to federal health authorities for insurance verification, your DNA was automatically scanned through the National Identification System, and it matched the profile of a child abduction case from over 30 years ago in New York." The world around me seemed to stop. I heard his words, but they sounded distant, muffled, as if coming from another realm. Abduction? 30 years ago? New York? I shook my head, grasping for a logical explanation. "You must be mistaken," I said, my voice trembling. "I was born here in Rockford. My parents are Carl and Lorraine Dempsey. I have nothing to do with New York." The man with salt and pepper hair didn't respond immediately. He opened the folder, pulled out a sheet of paper, and slid it toward me. It was a printout with a black and white photo of a boy, about 2 years old. Big brown eyes, curly, tousled hair, and an innocent smile. I stared at the photo, and my heart seemed to stop. That face, it was identical to mine as a child. I'd seen the rare photos my mother kept in old family albums. But this wasn't from her album. Below the photo, bold text read, Weiner Whitmore, missing son of businessman Nathaniel Whitmore and his wife, Vivian Whitmore. My blood felt like it had turned to ice. Weiner Whitmore, I muttered, as if the name were a spell from another world. The younger man spoke, his voice gentle but certain. Your biological parents, Nathaniel and Vivian, submitted DNA samples years ago, hoping one day to find their son. After nearly 3 decades, through federal database matching, we discovered your blood sample is a perfect match to their profile. I couldn't speak. My mind was blank, save for one sentence, looping like a broken record. So, for 30 years, I've been living in a family that isn't mine. I wanted to laugh, to think this was a joke, but the serious expressions of the two men left no room for doubt. They weren't lying. They weren't mistaken. The older man handed me another sheet, asking me to sign to consent to a second DNA test for full verification. I took the pen, my hand shaking so badly the ink smudged on the paper. I signed, not knowing what I was doing, only knowing I needed answers, no matter how terrifying. Before leaving, they gave me a business card, saying a lawyer representing the Whitmore family would meet me the next morning. They've been waiting for you for a long time, the older man said, his voice softening as if he too felt the weight of this moment. When the door closed, I sat there, still clutching the business card. The steady beep of the heart monitor filled the room, but I no longer heard it. Nathaniel Whitmore, Vivian Whitmore, names so foreign, yet tied to me by an invisible thread I couldn't comprehend. I thought back to the years of being belittled, called useless. The cold glares from Carl, the sweet but cutting words from Lorraine. I remembered the family dinners where I never belonged, the birthdays without cake or gifts. All the injustices, the pain I endured, now stood out like a painting drawn in cruel truth. I didn't belong to the Dempsey family. I had never belonged to them. The business card from the lawyer representing the Whitmore family remained in my hand, its edges crumpled from being clutched too long. I stared at it, the tiny letters dancing before my eyes. I couldn't sleep that night. The steady beeping of the heart monitor mingled with the sound of rain outside the window, but it only made me feel more lost. Who was I? Wyatt Dempsey, the machinist from Rockford, or Weiner Whitmore, a child stolen from New York? The question burrowed deep into my mind, unanswered. The next morning, pale sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting a faint glow on the cold, tiled floor. I was trying to eat a sandwich the nurse had brought when the door opened. A man walked in, about 50 years old, dressed in a sharp navy suit, his hair neatly combed, his eyes keen, but not cold. He introduced himself as James Hartley, the lawyer for the Whitmore family. He held a thick stack of documents, and his voice, though calm, carried a weight that made me sit up straight instinctively. Mr. Wyatt, he began, his tone deep and clear. The second DNA test has confirmed it. You are Weiner Whitmore, the long-lost son of Nathaniel and Vivian Whitmore. The match is absolute, with no margin of error. He slid the stack of documents toward me. On top was a sheet filled with numbers and charts I couldn't decipher, but the bolded line at the bottom seared into my eyes, probability of match, 99.999%. I stared at the paper, my hands trembling, unable to find words. Weiner Whitmore. That was me. Yet I still couldn't believe it. Mr. Hartley continued. Nathaniel Whitmore has been informed. He's on his way from New York to see you. He's eager to meet you. His voice softened, as if he understood that these words weren't just information. They were a bomb shattering my entire world. I nodded, speechless, because I didn't know what to say. Meeting my real father, a man I never knew existed. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, unsure where the next step would lead. That afternoon, the door opened again. I looked up, and this time it wasn't a nurse or a lawyer. It was an older man, his hair streaked with silver, wearing a gray wool coat, his deep brown eyes brimming with emotion. Before I could speak, he introduced himself as Nathaniel Whitmore, my biological father. He stood just a few steps away, his gaze lingering as if memorizing every detail of my face. I looked back at him, my heart pounding, my mind a whirlwind. I wanted to call him Dad, but the word caught in my throat. To me, he was still a stranger, though his eyes seemed to say otherwise. "Weiner," he said softly, his voice trembling. He stepped closer, sitting in the chair beside my bed, his hands clasped tightly, as if trying to hold back his emotions. I didn't know how to respond. I just looked at him, searching his face for something familiar, some clue about who I really was. But all I saw were his red-rimmed eyes reflecting a pain and hope I couldn't fully grasp. Mr. Hartley, standing in the corner of the room, began to explain, and what he said tore apart everything I thought I knew about my life. 30 years ago, when I, Weiner Whitmore, was 2 years old, I was kidnapped from my family's home in Albany, New York. 3 days later, the first ransom call came, demanding $500,000. My parents, Nathaniel and Vivian, paid, but I wasn't returned. 6 months later, another call demanded $1 million. They paid again, clinging to the faint hope that I was still alive. 2 years later, a third ransom demand asked for $1.5 million. In total, $3 million was extorted, but I remained missing. The kidnappers threatened to kill me if the police were involved, so my parents acted in secrecy. When the authorities finally stepped in, all traces had been erased. The intermediary accounts were fake, and no reliable leads remained. The case became one of New York's longest-standing missing persons cases. And no one expected I was still alive. Then Mr. Hartley said something that froze me. The FBI has identified the kidnappers. They were Carl and Lorraine Dempsey, the people you've called your parents for 30 years. My blood seemed to stop flowing. Carl, the cold man who always barked orders at me. Lorraine, the woman with her fake smile and disdainful glances. They had worked seasonal jobs for the Whitmore family, Carl as a security guard in their residential complex, Lorraine as a part-time housekeeper. They knew the family's routines and schedules intimately. After taking the money, they fled New York, changed their identities, obtained fake documents, and created a new birth certificate for me under the name Wyatt Dempsey, claiming I was born in Illinois. With those forged papers, I was enrolled in school and raised as a normal child, with no one suspecting anything for nearly 3 decades. I sat there, stunned, each word like a knife slicing into my heart. The people I called my parents, the ones who had just abandoned me in this hospital, were the ones who had stolen me from my real family. They didn't just take my childhood. They built an entire lie to cover their crime. Every cold glance, every insult, every moment I felt I didn't belong, it all made sense now. They didn't love me because I wasn't their son. I was just a commodity, a secret they had to keep hidden. I looked at Nathaniel, my real father, sitting before me, his eyes red, but trying to stay composed. "We never stopped looking for you," he said, his voice raw. "Every day for 30 years, your mother and I prayed you were still alive." I wanted to say something to comfort him, but I couldn't. The words caught in my throat, and all I felt was a storm inside, anger, pain, and an emptiness I couldn't name. A few weeks later, I was discharged from the hospital. My right arm, still in a cast, ached with every movement, a constant reminder of that fateful day at the factory. But my body had stabilized enough to leave the cold hospital room behind. Throughout that time, Nathaniel was by my side. He arranged for a private doctor, covered all the surgery costs, and never pressured me to call him Dad. He simply showed up every day, bringing coffee, newspapers, or sometimes just sitting beside me, sharing stories about New York that I'd never known. I could sense his patience, as if he understood I needed time to accept the truth, that I wasn't Wyatt Dempsey, but Weiner Whitmore, the son he'd lost for nearly 3 decades. Yet, no matter how gentle Nathaniel was, I couldn't shake the storm raging inside me. Every night I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, memories of Carl and Lorraine flooding back vividly. Carl's cold glares. Lorraine's fake smiles, their sharp words like knives. They were the ones who raised me, but also the ones who stole me, making me part of their lie. I didn't know what to feel, anger, pain, or just emptiness. But one thing was clear, I needed to confront them. Not to forgive, not to accuse, but to hear the truth from their own mouths. One morning, as pale sunlight filtered through the curtains, I looked at Nathaniel and said, I want to see them. Carl and Lorraine. I need to hear their reasons. Nathaniel met my gaze, a flicker of surprise in his eyes, but then he nodded. All right, whiner. I'll go with you. He called me by my real name, and this time I didn't correct him. I just nodded, feeling like a small step had been taken between us. We set out for Beloit, Wisconsin. The place I'd called home for 30 years. The car rolled down familiar roads, past golden cornfields glowing under the sun, past weathered billboards I could picture with my eyes closed. But today, everything felt different. I was no longer Wyatt Dempsey, returning to visit family. I was Weiner Whitmore, a stranger going back to face my past. The car stopped in front of the familiar two-story house. The white picket fence still stood, peeling slightly in places. The wooden steps creaked underfoot. The old flower pot sat quietly on the porch as if time had stood still. But as I stood before the door, a chill ran down my spine. Every brick, every window frame held memories. Not warm ones, but memories of evenings spent standing on the porch clutching a diploma no one cared about. Family dinners where I was just a shadow. Days spent trying to be loved only to receive disdain. I knocked on the door, my heart pounding. Nathaniel stood behind me, silent, but his presence gave me strength. The door opened, and Lorraine appeared. She froze, her eyes widening as if she'd seen a ghost. Wyatt, she whispered, her voice trembling. Before I could respond, Carl stepped out from the living room, his eyes weary, as cold as ever. But this time, I didn't look away. I met their gazes, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of fear in their eyes. We stepped into the living room. The air was heavy, so thick I could almost taste it. I could hear the ticking of the wall clock, each second stretching into an eternity. Nathaniel spoke first, his voice calm, but firm. I'm sure you remember me. I'm Nathaniel Whitmore, the biological father of the child you've raised for 30 years. I'm here only to hear the truth. He didn't mention the police or make threats, but his words carried a weight that Carl and Lorraine couldn't ignore. They stayed silent for a long time. I sat there, looking around the room, the dining table where I used to sit, the bookshelf where I once fixed a broken leg. Everything was familiar, yet now it felt like a dream that had dissolved. Finally, Carl spoke, his voice lacking the hardness I'd known. We didn't have a choice, he said, staring at the floor. Nathaniel placed the stack of documents on the table, undeniable evidence from the FBI. Carl looked at them, and I saw his shoulders slump, as if all his strength had been drained. He began to speak, each word like a knife cutting into my heart. He admitted to the kidnapping, the 3 ransom demands, $3 million in total. They had planned it meticulously, exploiting their familiarity with the Whitmore family to carry out the crime. After taking the money, they fled New York, changed their identities, and forged a birth certificate for me as Wyatt Dempsey, claiming I was born in Illinois. Lorraine began to cry, her sobs breaking the silence. She said, trembling, that at first she cared for me out of fear. Worried that if they didn't keep me, Carl would be exposed. But over time, every time she looked at me, she saw her guilt. A guilt too heavy to face. To cope, she became cold, controlling, and disdainful, as if blaming me would ease her pain. Carl was different. To him, I was living proof of their crime, a dangerous liability he had to keep hidden until his dying day. I listened, but it felt like I was no longer myself. Each word they spoke peeled back layers of my childhood memories, revealing a raw truth. I was just a tool, a secret, a lie. I looked around the house. Everything familiar, yet now utterly foreign. I stood up, my voice low and resolute. If you had ever truly loved me, you would have told the truth long ago. Instead, You let me live in a lie. Lorraine burst into tears, trying to step closer, but I backed away. Carl bowed his head, avoiding Nathaniel's gaze. Nathaniel stood behind me, silent, but his eyes said everything, the pain of nearly 3 decades of waiting, loss, and finally finding his son again. The conversation dragged on in tension. Each word, each silence cutting deeper into the past of the 4 people in that room. The air in the room was heavy, as if the entire world was holding its breath. The steady ticking of the wall clock only amplified the suffocating tension. I looked at Carl and Lorraine, the people I once called parents, and felt an unbridgeable chasm between us. They were no longer the ones who raised me. They were the ones who stole me, making me a part of their 30-year lie. I wanted to ask more, to understand why they could be so cruel. But before I could speak, a sharp sound from outside shattered the silence. The screech of tires braking abruptly rang out, followed by flashing red and blue lights streaming through the window, casting shadows on the living room walls. Carl flinched, his eyes filled with panic, the first time I'd ever seen his usual hardness falter. Lorraine's face paled, her hands clutching the hem of her shirt as if grasping for something to hold on to before it slipped away. I stood there, silent, but deep down I knew this moment was inevitable. Nathaniel stood calmly behind me, his gaze steady, but I could sense his resolve. He had waited too long for this day. Federal agents opened the door. FBI! Stay where you are! The command echoed from the front yard, sharp as a blade. The flashing lights from the police cars flooded the room, illuminating the faces of the 4 people inside. 2 criminals. A father who had waited 30 years. And me, a son whose childhood had been stolen. I looked at Lorraine, tears streaming down her face, but this time I felt nothing. No anger, no pity, just a cold emptiness in my chest. The door swung open. 3 FBI agents stepped in. 2 in black jackets, the 3rd holding a thick file. They ordered everyone to stay in place, their voices leaving no room for resistance. Carl stood frozen, his hands hanging limply as if all his will had drained away. Lorraine collapsed into a chair, her trembling hands covering her face, her sobs choked and broken. One agent read the arrest warrant, his voice steady but cutting. Carl Dempsey, Lorraine Dempsey, you are under arrest for kidnapping, interstate extortion, and identity fraud. I stood silently, watching as Carl and Lorraine were handcuffed right before my eyes. Lorraine sobbed, her eyes searching mine, desperate, as if pleading for a shred of sympathy. But I couldn't respond. I just looked at them. The people who taught me how to hold a hammer, who cooked my dinners, who were once everything I called family. Now they were criminals, led away under the flashing red and blue lights. I didn't feel relief, nor did I feel sorrow. There was only a void, as if a part of me had been erased. Nathaniel and I were asked to go to the nearby FBI field office to assist with the investigation. In the interrogation room, the agents presented undeniable evidence, bank records of million-dollar transactions, forged identity documents, photos of Carl and Lorraine from 30 years ago, and a detailed timeline of the 3 extortion demands. Everything aligned perfectly with the case files from decades past. I sat there listening to each detail, feeling like I was watching a movie about someone else's life. Not mine. Not Weiner Whitmore's. Carl remained silent throughout the interrogation, his eyes vacant as if he had accepted his fate. Lorraine was different. She claimed she only followed her husband's lead, that things had gone too far. Her voice trembled, but I didn't want to hear it. Her excuses couldn't change the truth. They had stolen me from my real parents, built a life on lies, and abandoned me when I needed them most. The investigators informed us that Carl and Lorraine would be prosecuted in New York, where the kidnapping took place. They could face life in prison. I listened, but said nothing. I just wanted to leave that room, to escape the evidence, the confessions, and the memories weighing on my shoulders. In the hallway of the FBI office, I sat on a wooden bench, staring out through a glass window. The red and blue lights from the police cars still flashed, reflecting on my face, both bright and blurred. I didn't know what to feel. relief, grief, or just emptiness. The man who taught me how to hold a hammer, the woman who cooked my dinners, they were being led away as criminals. Despite their cruelty and selfishness, deep down, they were still part of the memories I grew up with. Watching them be taken away hurt more than I'd expected. Nathaniel sat beside me, silent, gently placing a hand on my shoulder. He understood that I had lost both worlds, past and present, in a single day. Though he had found me after 30 years, he knew the wound inside me wasn't just about my identity, but about trust. He quietly told the investigator he would handle all the legal proceedings and didn't want to put more pressure on me. I looked at him, gratitude mixed with a sense of unfamiliarity. He was my father, but I still didn't know how to call him that. In the days following Carl and Lorraine's arrest, the entire country seemed to be talking about my story. The media covered it relentlessly, from national news to local papers. The name Wyatt Dempsey vanished, replaced by Weiner Whitmore, my true name boldly printed in FBI files and splashed across headlines. Child missing for 30 years found, they wrote, as if I were a miraculous tale. But for me, each line felt like a knife, a reminder of the years stolen from me. Nathaniel stayed in Beloit, renting a room at a small hotel near the town center. He didn't pressure me to move to New York right away, to call him Dad, or to become Weiner Whitmore. He simply stayed by my side, bringing hot coffee and a sandwich each morning, eating breakfast with me in the quiet hotel room. We didn't talk much. Sometimes he spoke of Albany streets, the golden autumn leaves, or fishing trips with his father when he was young. I listened, nodded, but inside there was still an emptiness. We were like two strangers trying to get to know each other after 30 years apart. One afternoon, as the sunset cast a golden glow over the small street outside the hotel, Nathaniel sat across from me, his eyes gentle but meaningful. "Do you want to go to New York?" he asked, his voice soft as a breeze. "Your mother and sister are still waiting." I stayed silent, gazing out the window where dry leaves swirled on the sidewalk. I wasn't sure I was ready. New York. The Whitmore family. It was all still a foreign world. But deep down, I knew I had to face it. Not just them, but myself. Finally, I nodded. "I want to meet them," I said, my voice barely a whisper. Nathaniel smiled, a faint but warm smile. He placed a hand on my shoulder, a brief touch, but enough to make me feel the gap between us slowly closing. 2 days later, we boarded a flight to Albany. From the airport, a car picked us up, driving through tree-lined streets to the Whitmore estate, the place where 30 years ago I had been stolen. I looked out the window, seeing tall oak trees and old-fashioned houses peeking through the foliage. Everything felt both unfamiliar and strangely familiar, as if I were traveling back in time to where it all began. As the iron gate opened, a grand old house came into view, its dark-tiled roof and ivy-covered walls striking against the greenery. I stepped out of the car, my legs feeling like lead. Nathaniel walked beside me, silent, but his eyes seemed to guide me. Then the front door opened, and Vivian Whitmore, my biological mother, stepped onto the porch. She froze, her eyes wide as if unable to believe I was standing there. For a moment, time stood still. I looked at her, seeing eyes the same brown as Nathaniel's. The lines of years etched on her face. And then, tears fell. Vivian rushed forward, enveloping me in a hug. I stood rigid, unsure what to do. But then I tightened my arms, returning her embrace. We cried, unable to hold back. She touched my face, her fingers trembling as if trying to memorize every feature, to make up for the lost years. "Weiner," she whispered, her voice choked. "My son." For the first time in my life, I felt the true warmth of a family, something I had never known in 30 years. Nathaniel stood nearby, silent tears streaming down his cheeks. After 3 decades of searching, he was finally watching his wife embrace their son. From the staircase, another woman descended. Violet Whitmore, my biological sister. She stood there, her hands trembling, her eyes hesitant. Then she stepped forward, wordlessly, placing a hand on my bandaged arm and burst into tears. I nodded, my lips quivering, unsure what to say. The feeling of both familiarity and distance made my heart ache. We hugged. Two siblings reunited after 30 years, yet separated by a gap time couldn't measure. In the living room, I saw family photos on the walls, old keepsakes preserved like treasures. Vivian, her voice breaking, told me she had never cleared out the room meant for the boy. Every week I cleaned it, as if you might come back any moment, she said. She led me upstairs and opened the door to a small room. Inside, I saw a little wooden toy car, a green wool blanket, and an old family photo on the table. I sank to my knees, touching the toy, feeling as if I were touching a piece of my stolen childhood. Tears fell, too fast to wipe away. That evening, we gathered for our first meal together in 30 years. No music, no fanfare, just a simple dinner, candlelight flickering, and tear-filled eyes. I didn't say much. Quietly listening to Violet's laughter, Vivian's storytelling, and Nathaniel's warm, steady voice, I tried to etch every moment into my memory, afraid that if I closed my eyes, it would all vanish like a dream. At the end of the meal, Vivian gripped my hand tightly. "Nothing can make up for the years we lost," she said, her voice trembling. "But we'll spend the rest of our lives trying." Nathaniel looked at us, his eyes shining but tinged with sorrow. I nodded slightly, saying nothing. The pain inside me hadn't vanished, but for the first time, I felt I truly had a place to call home. The trial of Carl and Lorraine Dempsey quickly became the focus of the nation. Television broadcasts and front-page articles all screamed the same headline: 30-year-old kidnapping case finally closed. The name Wyatt Dempsey was erased from all documents, replaced by Weiner Whitmore. As if I were stepping into a new life, a new identity. But for me, every line in the newspapers, every comment on TV, was a painful reminder that I had lived a lie for nearly 3 decades. The case was transferred to the federal court in New York, where it all began. I was invited to attend the trial as a victim, but I didn't want to stand at the podium or recount my story for the world to hear. I sat silently in the gallery, my gaze empty, feeling neither hatred nor pity. Carl and Lorraine sat a few meters away, but it felt like they belonged to another world. Carl, with his silver hair and weathered face, kept his head bowed throughout the trial. Lorraine, her eyes swollen, constantly wiped away tears. I looked at them but felt nothing. No anger, no sorrow, just an unnameable void. The court announced the investigation's findings. Carl was the mastermind, orchestrating the ransom calls and siphoning over $10 million through fake accounts. Lorraine was an accomplice, helping to conceal the crime and raising me under a false identity for 30 years. They were charged with kidnapping, interstate extortion, identity fraud, and obstruction of justice. After 3 months of trial, the verdict was delivered. Carl received life imprisonment without parole. Lorraine was sentenced to 30 years, with the possibility of a reduced sentence if she cooperated in further investigations. When the verdict was read, Lorraine's sobs echoed through the silent courtroom. Carl only bowed his head, his eyes vacant, as if he had long accepted his fate. I left the courtroom before the crowd stood up. I couldn't look at them any longer, not out of hatred, but because the pain was enough. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed me. Microphones thrust in my face, questions pouring like rain. "How do you feel about the kidnappers' conviction? Can you forgive them?" I paused, took a deep breath, and said only one thing. "I don't hate them anymore. I just want to live as my true self." Then I walked away, leaving the flashing cameras and noise behind. I returned to Albany with Nathaniel and Vivian. They offered to let me stay at the Whitmore estate, but I asked to move into a small apartment near the city center. I needed time to adjust, to find myself amid the ruins of my past. The new apartment wasn't much different from my old one in Rockford. Small, simple, with a window overlooking a noisy street. But here, I felt lighter, as if each breath was a chance to start over. On Nathaniel's advice, I began attending therapy sessions. The therapist suggested I write down my memories as a way to heal. I spent hours at the kitchen table, piecing together fragmented moments, the years in Beloit, Carl's cold glares, Lorraine's fake smiles, and the first warm moments with the Whitmore family. Each word was a knife, but also a step toward letting go of the past. Though I inherited a substantial fortune from the Whitmore family, I lived as I always had, driving my own car, cooking my own meals, and finding work as a technical consultant at a local machine shop. I didn't use the Whitmore name for special treatment. I wanted to stand on my own, as I had for the past 30 years. On weekends, I returned to the Whitmore estate for dinner with the family. Vivian's Sunday meals were always lavish, the scent of fresh-baked bread and stewed meat filling the house. Violet often shared stories of her childhood, growing up with the shadow of a lost brother. She spoke of times she looked into my old room, imagining I was still there. Nathaniel took time to tell me about the family business, not pressuring me to take it over, but wanting me to understand our legacy. I listened, nodded, and slowly I felt a connection I'd never had before. That night, I sat on the porch, watching the city lights reflect in my steaming coffee. My life had come full circle, from darkness to light. I knew I'd never forget what I'd lost. The stolen years, the buried pain. But I also understood that justice wasn't just the sentences handed to Carl and Lorraine. Justice was the chance to live again as my true self, Weiner Whitmore, no longer anyone's shadow. In the days that followed, I began to learn how to slow down, to breathe, to embrace the silence. Perhaps after 30 years of running from the past, the hardest thing wasn't forgiving others. It was learning to forgive myself. One tranquil early autumn evening, I sat in my small Albany apartment, a notebook from my therapist in front of me. She had told me to write down my true feelings as a way to confront and heal. The tea beside me had gone cold, and the streetlight filtered through the window, casting a glow on the blank page. I picked up the pen, my fingers slightly trembling, and began to write. I lived 30 years in a story that wasn't mine. But perhaps that's what taught me more than anyone the meaning of the word freedom. Memories flooded back, vivid and sharp like an old film. I heard the roar of the steel press in the factory. Felt the searing pain tear through my arm. Saw myself lying in the cold hospital room with a silent phone, no calls coming through. I remembered Carl's cold glares, Lorraine's fake smiles, and the moment Nathaniel first hugged me, his voice breaking as he called me Weiner. Each memory was a cut, but also a piece of the puzzle, helping me understand that life, despite its wounds, always leaves a door open. You just need the courage to step through. I kept writing, each line pouring from my heart. Justice to me wasn't watching Carl and Lorraine be punished. Justice was no longer letting them control my emotions. I chose to forgive, not because they deserved it, but because I deserved peace. Hatred, I realized, is an invisible chain binding you to the past. Sometimes the only way to be free is to let it go. I let go not to forget, but to move forward, to stop carrying the weight of those stolen years. In the notebook, I wrote about family, not just where you're born, but where you choose to belong. I once thought I had no one, that I was a lonely shadow in Carl and Lorraine's house. But with Nathaniel, Vivian, and Violet, I realized family isn't just blood. It's in the way they opened their hearts to me. The way they patiently walked through my pain with me. Vivian didn't try to erase my past. She held my hand, guiding me through the wounds. Nathaniel didn't push me to become an heir. He just wanted me to know I always had a home. Violet, with her stories of her childhood, showed me I was never forgotten, even when I didn't know they existed. During an interview after the trial, when a reporter asked how I wanted to be remembered, I said, I don't want to be remembered as a kidnapping victim, but as a man who chose to stand up, to live honestly and kindly, even when the world lied to him. Those words weren't for show. They were a promise to myself. I declined Nathaniel's offer to take an executive role in his company. Instead, I chose to work as a community advisor for the Whitmore Foundation, helping missing children and victims of domestic violence. To me, helping them find themselves was the best way to know I was truly healing. One day, I was invited to speak at a local university. Standing before hundreds of students, I looked into their young, hopeful eyes and said, "Sometimes we can't choose where we come from, but we can always choose how we live afterward." I shared my journey not to boast but to show them that life, however harsh, always has an escape. I urged them to cherish the simple things, a home, a meal, someone willing to listen, because those were what I'd lost for 30 years. And I emphasized, don't let your past define you. It's where you came from, not where you have to stay. As dawn broke, I closed the notebook. I stepped onto the balcony, feeling the cool late autumn breeze. The sky was shifting colors, the radiant sunrise filtering through the trees like the light I once thought I'd never see again. I took a deep breath, and for the first time, I felt lighter. I was no longer the stolen child, no longer Wyatt Dempsey living a lie. I was Weiner Whitmore, a man who had found himself amidst the fragments of his past. Standing on the balcony, watching the first rays of dawn pierce through the trees, vibrant and warm, I reflected on my life. After 30 years, it had taught me that justice isn't just a verdict in a courtroom, it's the truth laid bare, no matter how painful. Love isn't just in blood ties, but in the way people choose to stay, to hold hands through wounds. And happiness sometimes isn't about reclaiming what was lost, but learning to cherish what remains. A home, a meal, a sincere glance. I, Weiner Whitmore, had found light among the broken pieces, and I knew that with enough courage, anyone could do the same. What about you? Have you ever had a moment that completely changed your understanding of your past, or maybe even your identity? I'd really love to hear your thoughts in the comments below.